Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our panelists and welcome to the audience for this launch of the latest Socialist Register called New Polarizations and Old Contradictions, Crisis of Centrism. I'm Michelle Williams, and I'm going to be chairing this event today. So just to give you a sense, I'm going to, there's going to be the 5 speakers. They're each going to have a maximum of 10 minutes. And then we have 2 discussants. So our first speaker is going to be Greg Albo, and together with Colin Leys and the late Leo Panich, he is a co-editor of the Socialist Register. He is a professor at York University in Toronto, and he's also the editor of the State Transformations class, classes, Strategy and Socialism in 2021. So Greg, if you can begin, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for hosting the launch of the new Socialist Register volume. Thank in particular Vish, who helped organize it, with Michelle and Jane Cherry, the Democratic Marxism project that Vish has been heavily involved in for a number of years, as well as the other sponsors and the Wits University as well. The South African comrades have been such an inspiration to me for such a long time, given part of the generation in the universities through the 80s that was very active in the anti-apartheid struggle. So it's always kind of a, it still remains a thrill to speak with friends in South Africa on that basis. Not just them, because it's also, I think, the struggles in South Africa around AIDS, climate change, building a socialist union movement have been, continue to inspire, friends like Vish and Salim Bali, Patrick Bond, Erwin Jim at NUMSA, Michelle and others are kind of always kind of inspiring. I someday want to keep up Vish's pace with his kind of ability to kind of keep involved in so many campaigns, and I think that almost the daily editorials he's writing on this and that. So there's always that bar to try to reach. So I'm really pleased to kind of be part of the part of this launch with the comrades in Johannesburg. This volume will be the last that comes out under Leo Panich's name as co-editor. His sudden death when we were beginning the volume remains, I guess, to me personally, as well as many others, a shock. Just to, in the fall before he passed, we were actually in the process of making 5- and 10-year plans for the register and various other political things we were involved in. And just losing him as part of life, we had kind of worked, I don't know, I think around 20 volumes we had put together over the years, and along with kind of endless numbers of political statements, workshops, seminars, the whole gamut of stuff, So it's a big gap in my life in Toronto, just daily politics, and for doing the register, it kind of remains a bit disoriented. When you're doing the work with register, you kind of always have Leo's big arms out there ready to grab you and catch you if you should falter, and so you could kind of just go on and enjoy the political debate and etc. Didn't have to quite be at the center of managing it. I was very, very fortunate to fall into the only slightly smaller arms of Colin Leys in managing this register, and only slightly smaller arms in the sense of Colin's a little bit smaller than Leo, but Colin's editorial abilities are legendary, and his range of politics that he's commented on brilliantly over many years. We all respect and recognize Colin's work for all across the world. I was lucky; he was also kind of in a way an old friend. I'd first met Colin in the 1980s with Leo. We're all when Leo was living in Ottawa, and we were all part of editing the Studies in Political Economy, the Socialist Journal in Ottawa. So, it's been a bit of adjustment to this. The conception of this volume, which Leo was totally immersed in some senses, it comes out of in a way, a decade or more of editing the register together, and and the kind of the 5-year plans that we've had to kind of conceiving the volumes as we've been going along. The first group of volumes we've worked in came in the midst of the great financial crisis, of 2008 to 2010. And we were looking at those first volumes on the impact of the crisis, its consequences in terms of both ruling and working class social structures and strategies. And what it was clear, after a few years in, that the crisis, had caused a great disorientation and reconfiguring of much of working class politics and ruling class strategies. But on the other hand, neoliberalism remained in place. It had not been swept to the side. The working class remained relatively disorganized, although there was always continual punctuations of great struggles and new organizing efforts that were inspiring. Austerity was becoming a part of the permanent landscape, and the social and political displacements that were part of the consequences of the great financial crisis were everywhere to be seen, and in the marginalizations of the most weakly organized workers, the greater range of pauperism that was showing up on the streets across the world, and so on. So I think, one of the key themes that we were stressing in those volumes was that the contradictions of neoliberalism remained everywhere to be seen, but we're taking a kind of more severe direction, and some of the politics that were emerging were becoming very harsh and more authoritarian. The second group of volumes kind of picked up on those themes. And we wanted to place those a bit in longer term perspective. That was partly triggered because the whole world was kind of going through some reflections on the history of socialist politics through the 20th century as a result of the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, and so we wanted to kind of think, put these developments into some sort of longer term perspective over a range of volumes: Rethinking Revolution, Rethinking Democracy, A World Turned Upside Down, dealing with the geopolitics. And a volume when we started it that seemed, to some thought we were stretching ourselves a bit far, but on the other hand, it proved very prescient, was we did a volume on the politics of the right, and again trying to put this in perspective of looking over the very long term of the trajectory of the right across the 20th century, from the emergence of fascism, with several articles looking at the current right from that perspective. And clearly it was necessary to do a global scan of the way the politics of the right was forming around the globe. And in that sense, another kind of theme that was consistent was the rethinking of socialist strategy in the context of political polarization that was now most evident, in the same timing as that volume, with the emergence of Trump and the particular types of polarization that was occurring in the U.S., but was evident, in these new authoritarian governments coming up everywhere: Brazil, India, obviously Hungary, Poland, and so on and so forth. So it wasn't kind of concentrated only in the politics of the so-called West, but was everywhere around the world. If I might, and to just bring Leo into the meeting more directly, I'd like to just quote from the preface and the commissioning letter that we passed on to our essayist trying to frame the volume. So in the letter we wrote, with the word polarization now on the lips of commentators on the left, as well as mainstream journalists everywhere, we feel it is the responsibility for the Register to undertake a deeper analysis of the current political and economic moment by addressing the underlying social contradictions that are producing these polarizations. It is one of the great ironies of our times that just 2 decades after capitalism became the singular global mode of production, as capitalist accumulation and social relations finally penetrated every corner of the earth over 150 years after the Communist Manifesto predicted this, that polarization of politics, income and wealth, gross consumption along abysmal poverty, of ecological destruction are there for all to see. Leo then insisted in our letter, commissioning letter, to quote Philip Roth, the great Jewish novelist from the States, and is noting that in one of his novels a multitudinous intensity of polarities piled shamelessly upon polarities to comprise not a company of players, but the single existence, this theater of one. And as we were working and developing the volume, as was Leo's kind of want, he was consistently bringing out this Roth quote, and why he said this is what we had to try to capture, the way that polarizations were piling on in different parts of the world and try to understand and explain them, but the way that they were intersecting and not just kind of leaving themselves there. So often he, as Colin could tell you, often had a guide like this as you were working together, kind of pulling the themes together. Colin and I tried to kind of flesh some of this out, of the thinking about polarizations in the context of socialist theorizing for many years, and it just seemed logical, since that has been a starting point for so many of us, the thinking about the relationship of social polarizations in capitalism with Marx. And just to remind people, of course, there's in the Communist Manifesto, which we quote in the preface, the more or less open civil war raging within existing society, up to the point where the war breaks out into the revolution and lays the foundation for the sway of the proletariat. There's also kind of the great chapter that we kind of all learn in detail in Capital, the general law of capitalist accumulation, where Marx writes, accumulation of wealth at one pole is therefore at the same time the accumulation of misery, to the torment of labor, slavery, ignorance, brutalization at the opposite pole, i.e. on the side of the class that produces its own product as capital. And then there's, of course, the theme in the chapter on the workday, the main chapter in Capital, where Marx kind of brings the class struggle fixated on Britain, but as a generalization of what's occurring across the world, and the struggle that he's highlighting there in the formal structure of capitalist social relations and in the legal structure. The capitalist maintains his rights as a purchaser. The worker maintains his right as a seller. Between equal rights, force decides. And it is that kind of theme of force that we kind of also wanted to seem so clear to raise in the polarizations of the moment because of the authoritarian governments that are anywhere. I think the essays that we saw to gather and collect and commission, which Leo and I largely did, and as we were kind of coping with the fallout from the pandemic, as you know, as we were all struggling as writers and researchers around the world, struggling to keep pace with personal lives and our activism and research. We're struggling with, Colin and I kind of rounded that off. We were trying to cover issues around income polarization, around the new geopolitics, the longer term setting of this authoritarianism that's been emerging, in the light of kind of the authoritarian politics through the 20th century, on the polarizations around the pandemics. We also wanted to cover what we thought were the key places where this kind of evidence was this kind of polarization and contradictions were most evident in Brazil, South Africa, India, and Russia. And it's also what it had us gather what I think is an outstanding set of essays dealing with the contradictions of Trump and the politics, Trump and post-Trump, and the left in the U.S. thinking of how it's going to respond to this debate, with a series of kind of the most eminent strategists in the U.S. Commenting on those. And finally, the way that this was posed for the left and alternatives around the polarized options, as Sam Gindin frames it in his essay, that we're now confronting, dealing with also the question of the falseness of or what Samir Gandhi calls the false concreteness of identity politics, and the way that we need to struggle for a new politics of a new universalism in our politics. And of course, kind of one of the things we had to deal with is, of course, is the great feelings of setback we've had from the faltering of the Corbyn project in Britain, the DSA in the US, and other projects in the rest of the world spinning. And that's also why we sought out the dialogue between James Schneider and Hilary Wainwright. So that's the volume. I hope you enjoy it. You're going to hear some great speakers today. I'm dying to hear them kind of verbally present their ideas. They were great fun, this group to kind of work with. Bill recalls his essay that was in the 2016 volume on the politics of the right, his famous essay, Stars and Bars. He's been one of the great commentators on this. And then, of course, you all know Vish, and we're happy to hear him, and James is here as well. I'll turn it over to Colin to kind of keep going on the overall conception of the volume. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Greg. Colin Leys is going to be our second speaker, and he's also the co-editor of the Socialist Register. He's a professor emeritus of Queen's University in Kingston, and he's the co-author of Searching for Socialism. Also, it's a 2020 publication. Colin?
Yes, thank you so much, and thank you, Vish, and all your colleagues for organizing this meeting. I'm really pleased to be invited. And like Greg, I have to begin with Leo. We met in, you could believe this, first in 1976. And that year, he started me collaborating with him and Greg and others on the new journal, Studies in Political Economy. And we went on collaborating in one thing and another until the week before he died. So it was a terrible blow. And I actually feel very grateful to Greg in being invited to help him finishing this volume. It was like being, in a way, continuing a bit of collaboration with Leo, and it was very, very important to me to sustain me through that year. They conceived the volume, and Greg was the driving force in seeing it through. So I can say without any false pride that it's a great volume, and I recommend it very strongly. Greg suggested that rather than make a catalogue, I would pick out 2 or 3 essays that I was particularly involved with, or that I particularly want to recommend. And it seems invidious to do that without recommending all the others, including Vish's own remarkable essay. Incidentally, Vish, I don't think anybody has emulated that for any other country yet, and it's a really important example which needs following. So I, rather idiosyncratic, will talk on 3 particular pieces. The last project Leo and I did together was the book Greg's mentioned, Searching for Socialism, about attempts in the Labour Party in the last 50 years to democratize the party and turn it into a vehicle capable of pushing forward the socialist project, first led by Tony Benn, and secondly under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. And so to analyze that, we had to grapple ourselves, keep talking to ourselves about neoliberalism on a global scale, in which the UK project and its challenges and ultimate defeat were implicated. And that made us especially concerned with, and me especially interested in, Simon Mohan's essay, which begins the volume, on neoliberalism, on a contemporary portrait, a portrait of contemporary neoliberalism. What Simon Mohan shows is that neoliberalism produces not just extreme inequality, but a very specific form of extreme inequality, a destructive form. 1% of the populations of the powerful, largest economies in the world have accumulated an astonishing share of the world's gross product. And this, combined with globalization and financialization, gives rise to the phenomenon of huge pools of investable funds being shunted by individuals who control them from one bubble to the next, in and out of high-risk investments in a wildly destabilizing way. And at the same time, the running down of state capacities for planned economic intervention means that the conditions for stability and for the existence of capital itself are being progressively undercut. And Mohan ends like this, and I'd just like to quote from his last page. This is specifically relating to the climate problem. Adaptation to climate change requires major state action to force capital to bear the full costs of its drive to accumulate, and hence to completely alter its calculus of risk and return in making investments. This means much more than setting targets for carbon reduction. It means coherent planning for how those targets are to be achieved. Given the hollowing out of the administrative capacities of the neoliberal state and the political unwillingness to contemplate the huge tax changes required to incentivize private capital to move significantly towards carbon neutrality, the challenge presented to neoliberal capitalism by the climate emergency is immense and may be insuperable. And he concludes, it has never been more important to impose the ways in which neoliberalism privatizes its gains and socializes its losses. And that leads me to the second piece that I wanted to specially recommend, which is in fact Hilary Wainwright's interview with James Schneider, who was Jeremy Corbyn's spokesman and the director of communications for Corbyn's leadership team. Well, since James is here, I don't want to preempt anything he has to say, but I think James may very likely talk on the question of how that challenge posed by Simon Mohan to oppose neoliberalism can be sustained, and not just sustained as an opposition, but something that would go forward, push forward towards socialism. This means he may not have much time to say about his experience inside the Corbyn team, which is a very specific thing. And this is what he does in the interview with Hilary Wainwright, a detailed analysis of the hard, often painful lessons to be learned from that uniquely important moment in the fight for democratic socialism. And I think everyone who is serious about socialist struggle needs to read that story, however much it is restricted to the framework of the United Kingdom. And finally, let me put in a quick word for one other piece, which is a piece by Marcus Gilroy Ware on social media. We're all inclined to blame the social media for this and that, for the defeat of Corbyn, or the success of Trump, or the resistance to vaccines, or racism. Marcus makes a principled socialist critique of that position. And it's a sharp but entertaining polemic, a gentle polemic. So kind of polemic we haven't had nearly enough of in these rather depressing years. I'd suggest read it, you'll enjoy it and feel a bit cleaner and clearer afterwards. Thanks, Michelle.
Right. Wonderful. Thanks, Colin. And you made up some time for me. Thank you. So that was wonderful. Thank you both, Colin and Greg. Yeah, and I'm glad you have given tribute to Leo, because I think we all, it's still something I think we're on. So it's wonderful for us to host this as well. Okay, so the next speaker is Vishwas, and he's an associate professor of international relations, and he's the principal investigator for the Emancipatory Future Studies in the Anthropocene at Wits University. Vish?
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. So, yeah, I mean, we're all wrestling with Leo's loss, and it's a big loss for the global left, but also for the left in South Africa. I must also say that it was a great pleasure to work with Greg and Colin in putting this essay together. They were great guides, and they really helped me over the finishing line in many ways. I must also say that, you know, when I received this brief and engaged with Leo, I mean, this idea of contradictions, you know, sort of eating away at South African society, kind of stimulated me to think about how we're thinking about crisis. And I've been doing a lot of work on thinking about crisis. And for me, I think Marxist feminism is a very important guide. And I think that's what also informs this essay. I mean, what are the deep contradictions in the realm of production, and what are the deep contradictions in the realm of socio-ecological reproduction? And I think this is what shaped my own thinking. I wrote this essay before the looting sort of erupted in South Africa in July of 2021. It was a seismic moment in South African political life. We were literally on the brink of a civil war in the country, in my view, and it could have gone very, very badly for our young democracy. And I think here you really saw the kind of contradictions that I grapple with in this essay playing themselves out. The other point I want to make is, you know, thinking about this pathogen and its impact on our life world, it was extremely profound. I mean, it gridlocked everything in our lives. I mean, it gridlocked circuits of, it blocked the movement of ships, planes, etc. And I think that's its defining conjunctural significance. And in that context, when this met ruling class power structures, including in South Africa, these the ruling class had to really grapple with this moment. Most of them were not, including South Africa. They had to work out how to rule, how to govern these very polarized societies, given decades of neoliberalism. And so I think this was very, very revealing. Now, in the South African context, the pandemic met, in my view, continuities of crisis, of neoliberalization of South African society since our democratic advance in 1994. And there have been key conjunctural moments here where the kind of rupturing of national liberation politics has been unfolding. So, you know, and at one level, and this audience here is very familiar with it, so I'm not really going to go into it. But at one level, while we've had a sort of multi-class alliance coming to the fore, particularly in the post-94 period, the institutional basis of this has been unraveling. Okay, so if you think about the convergence of forces that come out of the long struggle in South Africa, that kind of cement the ANC's hegemony and bring it to power, those forces have really been in a state of de-radicalization, crisis, division, and institutional disconnection, and so on. And I think that's also something that brought itself into the COVID moment. What we've really seen happening in the context of the ruling class in South Africa are splits, realignments, re-racializing of politics, xenophobia, precariousness, and a real crisis of a thin market democracy. So all of these crises dynamics came into the crisis, the conjunctural moment of COVID-19. So it's here that I kind of look at this ruling class and trying to think about how they're dealing with this moment. And clearly this embedded liberal imaginary, this rationality and logic continues to shape their response in this conjunctural moment. And you see it reflected in the lockdown regime that came to the fore, very elaborate, very clumsy, but in the end, balancing the requirements of capital accumulation all the time. So, hard lockdown, of course, you move towards a complete openness increasingly in 2020, and then a kind of reluctance to kind of really kind of put the screws back on. But in the main, working with the assumption that the economy is the economy that will create jobs. This is the economy that will keep South Africa going, etc., which is really faulty thinking. And then, of course, mitigating the socioeconomic hardships that come with this pandemic. Again, the state comes short in so many ways, but there are various mechanisms that come to the fore. And then finally, I think the state understood that we were in the midst of a deep structural crisis, and that the pandemic has exacerbated some of that, and there was a need to kind of find a way forward. The economic recovery plan articulated by the president, but then again, break what has been in our national policy discourse and agenda and so on. So in a sense, a lot of the old comes to the fore in the midst of this new conjunctural moment. I think the other points, just to make very quick, is if you really think about these serious socio-ecological contradictions, well, the healthcare system exemplifies this very starkly. We went into the pandemic with a failing healthcare system, stark health inequalities. Only 9 million people in South Africa being on medical aid as part of a population of about 59 million, about 1,250 intensive care beds in public hospitals. So we really stumbled into this thing, really, and in a situation where the healthcare system was failing most of society. We saw an attempt to put in place emergency capacity. We saw PPE kind of provisioning, and again, ensnared in the criminalized accumulation that has been in the making even before the COVID-19. And then, of course, austerity continuing, and then, of course, nurses and public healthcare workers and public sector workers picking up the flag to fight this and resist it. Unemployment, another very deep systemic contradiction, also impacting and registering in very profound ways in the in the COVID pandemic moment and conjuncture. Hunger, also a very serious problem, and all of these things cascading and working off each other. We now have a 46% unemployment rate in South Africa and over 60% youth unemployment rate. I was writing this essay before the data came in about some developments in the economy. So you really have, in many ways, an unviable society just at that level. At the same time, you've had almost 30 million people living below the upper bounded poverty line and being in a serious state of food insecurity and stress. So all of this also feeding into the crisis in South African society, with the state coming short in terms of its relief efforts, whether through existing social grants, which don't keep up with the basic basket cost of food, with even the social relief measures being very inadequate and limited, and of course, civil society stepping in to kind of fill gaps. Climate shocks continued during this pandemic, and we've been through the worst drought in the history of the country. To conclude, basically, South Africa is in a very, very dangerous place. Its national liberation project is unraveling. The factionalism, the institutional weaknesses, the class political divides are eating it up. And at the same time, we are in the midst of this multi-dimensional crisis that has been created by this national liberation movement. So we are seeing socio-ecological systems collapse in various parts of the society. We are seeing the weaknesses of the ANC engendering a new right wing in our society, both inside the ANC and alongside the ANC, a nativist, xenophobic, exclusionary nationalist right wing. But in this context, and I think what we've seen in this conjuncture was the emergence of a new cycle of resistance, new forces on the horizon. The big challenge we face is convergence. There has to be, in this moment in South Africa's history, a coming together to take on national liberation politics and to go beyond it. We need a new politics in South Africa today. Thank you.
Thanks, Vish. That was great, but also you were 1 minute. chair. You were great. You were way ahead of time. Thanks very much. And now we're going to move straight over to James. The fourth speaker will be James Schneider. And he's a communications director of Progressive International, a co-founder of Momentum, and former spokesperson for Jeremy.
Thanks very much, mate. It's wonderful to be with you, and I'm going to pretend that I'm really with you in Wits, where I've not been since towards the end of 2014. I think was the last time I was there. So my interview is trying to find lessons from the Corbyn project in the UK, and sometimes this is a bit difficult to find lessons from it for any other national context, or even for the British left now, because most of the accounts of the Corbyn project after the fact focus in basically entirely on contingent issues and blow-by-blow accounts of how things played out, without really zooming out and trying to see which factors are structural and which factors are contingent and therefore won't come again. And obviously every national context is different and every particular moment is different. The UK setting for the Corbyn project is that it came, or at least it seemed to come from nowhere. It came after 40 years of decline, really sharp decline for the British left. The trade union movement was a residue of its former self. It had nearly 14 million members in 1979. It's just over 6 million members of trade unions when in 2015, when Corbyn won the leadership election. And we had an anti-war movement, but we couldn't stop any wars. We had an anti-austerity movement, but we couldn't stop any cuts. And the self-conscious left and the socialist left was really very small and marginal to the national political debate. But out of that, we had three big leaps. The first was in 2015 in the Labour leadership election, which Jeremy Corbyn won by a landslide, coming as a complete outsider. No one had heard of him. He'd never had any front bench role within the Labour Party. He had been on the national scene as an opponent of the Iraq War, but hadn't been given very much media attention. He went from 200 to 1 outsider to win by landslide. We had another leap in 2016 with the second leadership election caused by an attempted coup against him, and then in 2017 by a general election, which was called by Theresa May in order to win a huge landslide, because Labour was obviously going to lose terribly because it was led by this incompetent socialist. And instead, we saw the largest increase of the vote for any party in any general election since 1945, running on a program of sort of solid social democracy, which had been so far outside the political mainstream for the previous kind of 40 years. Anyway, my point is that in the particular contingent example of Corbyn, the opportunity, i.e. leading a major party, having a socialist leadership that could enter the state, was so far ahead of how developed the party was or the progressive forces were. So really, the Corbyn project was occupying this gap between the possibilities of the moment, mainly caused by the organic crisis of ruling class hegemony, not by our power, and this gap between the moment and the strength of our movements. And basically it was about whether we could catch up or not. So what can we learn from that? So obviously there's some contingent factors like the conjuncture, Brexit, the particular human material that we had to work with, i.e. very few of us had any experience with any frontline politics at all. And had to learn very quickly. I myself, for example, was a journalist focused on Africa. I was working for New African magazine and sort of came in, effectively off the street to join the campaign. And yeah, there are various different contingent factors, but there are some constants which I think we can learn from both ourselves in the British left now. We're a bit shattered and confused, trying to work out what to do next. But I think also these constants that we can learn from are useful in other national contexts as well. These are some things which I don't think change. So we have the task. The task for socialists basically remains the same. It's to build a social majority and empower it with the force to act for itself. That's the task that we're engaging in. And if we're doing that properly, then we will have to overcome enormous opposition and attacks. Though there were a lot of people, I think, because there hadn't been a left advance in the UK for so long, were surprised by the real level of hostility that the Corbyn project faced internally, within the Labour Party and some of the Labour movement, within the media and from its opponents. But really, we shouldn't be at all. And I think, of course, in the South African context, there's and many other contexts, the opposition will come from, however you want to put it, empire. It's not just the domestic ruling class, but how that domestic ruling class fits into the global ruling class. And we saw that actually, just one aside, with Jeremy's leadership, the largest rebellion in Parliament of Labour MPs against Corbyn's leadership in a vote came on an issue of foreign policy. The largest rebellion was almost 100 Labour MPs rebelled to not support a motion against British arms sales to Saudi Arabia because of the war in Yemen. That was the largest rebellion. The biggest pushback we got from the Labour right and from the establishment were always over issues which seemed to run against the consensus viewpoint of the Western Alliance. But anyway, to deal with these things, to deal with this opposition, I think there are 5 broad categories of things that need to be done, need to be advanced, need to be worked on, and of course they'll be different for very different for different contexts. So the first is to pursue a majoritarian antagonistic narrative. I'm starting with the comms because I'm a comms person, but I don't think that everything is communications. But the opponents, if we're trying to build a majority, social majority, and our opponents will always try to present us as being fringe weirdos, some unpleasant body within within national society which is trying to undermine it. We always have to pursue majoritarian antagonistic. And that means wanting to grab controversy, leaning into rule breaking, and so the second is movement building. Oh, I should say that all of these 5 things are things which the Corbyn project did do in a limited way, but insufficiently. And I think really our defeat rests on how far we got in each of these 5 sort of broad categories. So the second is movement building, which is the strengthening and stimulating of progressive social forces. I'm going to speed up because I think I'm running out of time. The third is the development or the transformation of the political vehicle which you have, the political party or whatever, so that it has the will and the capacity to unite, mobilize, and organize for that social majority to be able to act, which means a whole host of things for how, some of which I go into a little bit in the interview with Hillary, about its structure, about how it develops cadre, and so on. Then, well, probably, or perhaps the most significant, I think what Colin was hinting at in his introduction of my interview is the preparing to go into the state and what our strategy is for that. And that was, I think, really rather underdeveloped within the Corbyn project, even though there were lots of people who were descendants of the Miliband, Ben, Panitch school of thought on these issues. It was still viewed as too much of a technical process. And in the interview, I go into 3 different types of reforms that we need to we need to prepare for, preparing for not just in a technical sense, but in a movement building sense, and in a cadre capacity sense as well, which are the ameliorative reforms. Those are the instant ones that you can do with existing state machinery to bring improvements to people's lives straight away. The second is strong reforms, which change the social contract, shift the social contract in a progressive direction. So the first would be tax and spend things. The second would be new rights and services. And the third is non-reformist reforms in the Gort sense of it, which have the capacity to go much further. Written within them, they have the capacity to take things further. And you have to get that balance, I think, correct. And then the final category is international alliances, and then I'll wrap up shortly. International alliances. Obviously, we can't go it alone in any country. And one of the ideas that we were told often is, there aren't votes in other countries, so don't focus on those issues, which I think is extremely short-sighted. Because, as I said, in the UK context, it's a site of great resistance, but also we're not, if you're advancing any socialist project in one country, you take great strength from what's going on in other countries, but also you're in power going to have to form a different set of alliances to not just be railroaded by the existing order. Anyway, so to wrap up, there are a huge range of lessons. Some of them I could go into in the interview in sort of more detail, and I think they can be applied to different contexts. I've tried to do that. I've just written a book which will come out later this year, trying to apply it to the UK context. But I would hope that there's some broader application. But I think that the most important thing to take from the Corbyn project, and this might seem strange to say in the face of defeat, but is basically hope and confidence. And I think the hope and confidence is because the rule of the few rests on extremely shaky grounds. I mean, this was a really ragtag outsider outfit of people with very little experience of the state or frontline politics, brought together with very little institutional support, with weak trade unions and social movements, and yet got quite close to the state, hit the bottom line of some sectors of capital and change the national conversation and advance it. So I think that our job as socialists, in whatever context we're in, is to help the majority unlock their own latent power by giving them the confidence and the capacity that they can act for themselves.
Great. Thanks very much, James. That's fantastic. No, great. You were great. Thank you. And next we have Bill. And then finally, we'll have Bill Fletcher. He's a longtime trade unionist in the US. He's a writer, past president of the TransAfrica Forum. Bill, are you there?
I'm here.
Oh, great. Excellent. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you. Greetings and good afternoon, good morning, depending on what part of the world you're in. My appreciation for being invited to do this, and my appreciation to Greg for having invited me to contribute to this volume, and for being a very good editor, along with Colin, even though we were driving each other crazy. Just being real, I'm from New York. So let me just summarize in a few minutes central points of the paper. One is that in order to understand Trump and the question of what comes next, you have to situate it in a global context. So we're dealing with, as I've been reemphasizing, a convergence of major contradictions, economic and environmental, which have brought about across the world a crisis in the legitimacy of the capitalist state. And it's within that context that we're operating. The second thing is that, as Nikos Poulantzas pointed out at the end of his life, there was a phenomena developing in capitalist states that he called authoritarian statism, which is not the same thing as a right-wing mass movement, but that there was a tendency, which I later went on to describe as neoliberal authoritarianism, that was starting to pervade capitalist states and narrow the parameters of democracy and democratic participation. And so we have found ourselves with the growth of this neoliberal authoritarianism, along with the growth of right-wing authoritarian mass movements. These two things are not the same. They sometimes converge, but they're not identical. Now, in terms of understanding Trump, the central thing is to get away from the notion of the focus on Trump the idiot, Trump the maniac, Trump the fascist. The more important thing is that he gave voice to something that has been beneath the surface and is partially emerged at different points in US history. So the underlying issue we're looking at is the growth of a right-wing populist mass movement. It is not something that is simply manipulated by a few maniacal capitalists. It's something that I describe as the herpes of capitalism, that right-wing populism is a virus in a system, and that when a system weakens, the virus fully emerges in various manifestations. But that the virus is there, it's in the system. And so one of the misunderstandings when looking at Trump was that people were focusing on him and only focusing on the moment and not understanding that there had been efforts to renew a sort of right-wing populist project in the late 1960s, a move away from simply put conservative populism into a more adamant right-wing populism that had within it a fascist element that has grown over time. Now, for us on the left, and I think this is not just true in the United States, there's a tendency to use the term fascist to describe anything that we don't like and anything that's repressive. So anytime the capitalist system uses violence, people will often talk about the fascists. And I think that this misreads the various forms of right-wing rule that we can encounter. And in a peculiar way, it almost mythologizes democratic capitalism and acts as if democratic capitalism has to be peaceful, whereas democratic capitalism is just simply not authoritarian. But there's nothing that says that it's particularly peaceful. Fascism is a mass movement, and it is a radical mass movement that is a subset of right-wing populism. And it's a mass movement that wishes to eliminate all vestiges of constitutional rule and democratic capitalism. And we've got to understand the particularities because it has strategic implications in terms of who you unite with at which points and what the level of the danger is. So when we're looking at Trump, we have to understand right-wing populism. We have to understand that the Republican Party of the United States, which has now become the party for dictatorship, has for quite a while been constructing a theory of minority rule. And so to some extent, even though many of us talk about the right-wing bloc as the neo-confederacy, you could almost define it as a neo-apartheid alliance, in that what they are attempting to do is to ascertain how to develop white minority rule in the United States when the demographics change the nature of the United States. And they also are doing something incredibly interesting, which is they're reaching out to racialized populations, at least some segments of the right are, and basically saying, to the extent to which you acknowledge the hegemony of the white republic, to the extent to which you do not challenge on the basis of race, we can find a place for you within the hierarchy of this reconstructed white republic. And so this is what's important when one looks at the efforts by Trump and his allies to reach out to Asians, Latinos, and even some segments of US Black Americans. The final thing about Trump that I want to say here in the interest of time is that there was an interesting debate that Greg, Colin, and I had about what actually happened on January 6th. Would you describe it as a riot, an insurrection, or a coup? A coup attempt? And I was adamant it was a coup attempt. And we went back and forth. I actually think, I hate to say it, I was right. That when you look at what was going on, there was an orchestrated move by a segment of the political class to change the entire terms of political operations in the United States, and to eliminate an opposition. And they had support within segments of the law enforcement and the military, but fortunately not enough. I think it's really important that we understand that although this coup attempt failed, we have to be very careful. And some comrades on the left have been very quick to discount what happened on January 6th as a sort of stupid riot on the part of the right. And I want to suggest as my next to last point, there's a story that Lukács tells in his book on Lenin about the aftermath of the Kapp Putsch in Germany in 1920. And he describes how German communists went to Moscow to give a report to Lenin on what had happened. And they gave this very deep, detailed report, and they ended by saying, and we will be prepared the next time the German right tries this. Lenin had been sitting there very patiently. And then he said, what makes you think the German reaction will manifest itself in the same way the next time? And that's the thing that we've got to be thinking about here, that there was a particular event on the January 6th and a particular manifestation within Trump. But we should not assume that the right, the far right, will continue to manifest itself in the same way. They will certainly engage in various kinds of acts of terror. They're doing it. They will certainly manifest themselves in legislative disruptions. They're doing it. But we should anticipate the unexpected. My final point, that what this means is that we on the left have to walk away from purism, and we have to build a very broad front to oppose the right. And for many comrades on the left, this is inconceivable because we are so used to being pure. And we insist that we and whoever else can fit in a phone booth are the only ones that really matter. I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Bill. I like that, the fitting in a phone booth. Okay, great. Thanks very much. I'm seeing some questions on the chat, which we'll come to later. So if you guys, the panelists can actually read, there's one already to James and there's one to Vish from Zico. So let me now go to our discussants. The two discussants then will be Samantha Hargreaves, and she calls herself a Pan-African ecofeminist, but Samantha is also the director of an extraordinary organization called WOMEN, which I have enormous respect for. And then we have Owanda Budalezi, and he's a researcher at the Cooperative and Policy Alternatives Center in Johannesburg, and he's an activist with the Climate Justice Charter movement. Ready, Samantha? Samantha, are you?
Yes, I'm here.
Ready.
Great, thank
Samantha
you so
Hargreaves.
much.
Okay, great. Thanks, Samantha. You're on.
So thank you for this marvelous Socialist Register for 2022, exploring such an important theme for all of us all over the world. And thanks for the previous speakers. I love what Bill said about the need, and I think it addresses some of the questions in the chat box about convergence and overcoming, the building of bridges. So yes, absolutely, the sort of revolution, the transformation we need ain't going to be achieved with a few people in a telephone booth. So I love that, Bill. I read many of the pieces, and some of them really stood out for me. But perhaps just to indicate that we were asked to speak to the implications of this analysis for struggle. And so I was reading very much with that cap on. And so just a couple of points. I think the one contradiction, polarization, that I was really searching for, because I work in the African context. So I work in the periphery. Obviously, South Africa is not the periphery. Nigeria might not be the periphery, but many of the countries I work with, work in on the continent, are deep in the periphery of the world. And I think this polarization between the periphery, the center of capitalism, so the center of imperialism, the old G7 nations, but then also the emerging nations. So it was great to see Brazil and Russia and South Africa, although I think South Africa sits in a different category, in the mix. And so I think the deepening polarization and the deepening marginalization of countries in the periphery is a really important question, and how these countries are being incorporated into a global capitalist system, but under very unfair terms. And this is really quite unbroken across the centuries. So it's evolved, it takes different forms, but if you look at the relationship between the periphery and the center and the new emerging sub-imperial nations, it really does center around the large-scale exploitation of natural resources. So I think that piece of the analysis I was really searching for and didn't find it. The second point that I wanted to make was around the contradiction between production and a productivist lens and social reproduction. So this question of social reproduction, the impacts of crises on social reproduction, does get picked up in different echoes across the publication. Vish does address this question. And I think this is a really important question, bringing the crisis of capitalism and the many crises that the world is sitting with, the climate crisis. The crisis of social reproduction is a major fallout. It's a consequence of the multiple crises. And so I think we have to be reflecting on social reproduction and who carries the burden of the fallout. And quite frankly, it is Black working class women across the world, both in the center, the periphery, and the sub-imperial nations. So this is a critical piece that I feel really needs to be perhaps explored in more depth. I think the question of the climate crisis it gets picked up across the book. And like Colin did, the sort of question of the climate crisis requiring major state action, forcing capital to bear the costs of the drive to accumulate, and hence to completely alter its curriculum of risk and return in making investments. I think this is such a critical question and really does guide a lot of the struggles in the region where people are resisting the large-scale exploitation of natural resources, which is such a key in the accumulation process of advanced capitalism. And so I think this question of forcing the internalization of costs to capital is such an important piece of our resistances now. And so Woman has been doing quite a lot of work thinking through costs from multiple perspectives, both from the perspective of social reproduction, ecology and climate, but also the externalized costs to future generations. And I think this is needs to be a major focus of how we build resistance and build struggle going forward, making that visible, but also forcing reparations from corporations, from governments that have subsidized and supported oil, coal, gas for decades. So this is a very important piece of our struggle. Just finally to say, I loved David Harvey's piece. This question of the double consciousness of capital, the different tendencies we've seen, particularly in Latin America, between the more productivist orientations, increasing extraction in order to support national development, and how there's a great contradiction between that pathway and the pathway of finding new roads. And yes, some of it might be idealistic, returning to the past, searching for answers in history, but at the center of this really is about protecting nature and the environment and really safeguarding our ability to survive as a species. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Samantha. Wonderful, as always. Great. Awanda. Awanda.
Thank you. I'll try not to speak for too long. Can you hear me? Okay. So this
I
volume.
will cut you off if you do. Thanks, Amanda. I can't see you. I can hear you. Thank you.
Can anyone else, is anyone else having the same problem? Okay. So this volume, New Polarizations, All Contradictions, The Crisis of Centrism, is a very timely and necessary volume in understanding the current moment which we find ourselves as a global society. I think the way in which the volume is set, beginning with the global polarizations, the global contradictions, and then understanding the crisis of centrist politics and the shift away from centrist politics, is very useful in helping to create a structure which helps lend itself to assisting for those on the ground, those engaged in struggles across the world, to connect their struggles, their moments or their contexts which find themselves within different understandings or spaces of polarization to the broader context of the global contradictions of capital in our current moment, and then a more consolidated move towards a focused thinking towards how we can use this moment to shift away from the centrist order, which has held most countries in the global order under its throes for the past couple of decades. I believe that the first section on global polarization is quite useful in helping to set a kind of survey or understanding of the various kinds of identity and broader kind of party, class, income and wealth inequalities that exist across different regions. I do believe, though, that I think something which we can do to take things forward is to also continue to try to tie all of these different inequalities and disparities with the concept of the socio-ecological, which I think is totalizing in the way in which it's affecting our planetary civilization. When it comes to understanding the global contradictions, the set of regional studies that are in this volume are very useful, I believe, in also grounding these contradictions in the different contextual conditions that each region faces. I think Vishwas' piece, for example, particularly from a South African perspective, is quite enlightening or elucidating rather, particularly as he said now that he'd written this piece before the looting erupted in July 2021. And the crisis of social reproduction is one which is particularly apparent or apt in the South African context. And I think that this piece in particular and the South African context more specifically can be quite instructive for other regions of the world with regards to the kind of disparities and violence that can erupt when these kind of polarizations exist at the level in which they do in our particular context, and in the way in which they continue to and will continue to persist in other regions of the world without and truly emancipatory alternatives to help move away from those kind of inequities. And I think that the context which is set in this section of the volume helps set a solid foundation in helping us understand what are the moves that we need to understand with regards to how a shift away from centrist politics can be pushed forward. I think James's interview is quite enlightening in that aspect, particularly as he was also speaking about right now, some of the other things that he proposed with regards to what is required in this moment to ground a move away from centrist politics and a move towards anti-capitalist alternatives. And I believe that those points that he put forward are quite instructive because they can be applied at all levels across all struggles, all these interlinking struggles that people face across the globe, particularly his points regarding the ameliorative reforms which I think are necessary and timely in our current moment, the strong reforms and the non-reformist reforms. Particularly also want to underline the call for Gramscian political organization, which stretches into society and seeks to link across these different forms of ongoing struggle. I think that the ecumenical approach, which is outlined here, does well to kind of set a solid collective foundation for which we can help link and engage in each other's understandings and ways to build for something more positive in the future. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Wanda. That was great. Okay, we've had fantastic inputs, and thanks to everyone very much, to both all the panelists as well as Samantha and Wanda. You guys were great. It's always an unenviable task, I find anyways, to be a discussant on a volume that no one else has read, but you must then in a few minutes have some profound words of wisdom, which you guys managed to do. So thank you very much. There are some comments. We're just going to be taking comments in the chat. So please write your comments and points in the chat. But I know, Bill, you have to leave at 5:30 South African time. I'm not sure what time it is for you, but there is a comment about the similarities between January 6th in the US and the July violence in South Africa. And I think it speaks to your larger point that it wasn't just about Trump, but there's larger systemic forces that were underlying the rise of authoritarianism and the demise of democracy. So I don't know if you just want to make a comment there, or if you want to have any reactions to the discussants and things before you have to go, and then I'll open it up to the others as well.
No, thank you. Yeah, I have about 10, 15 minutes. I think one of the things that's really important for us on the left to grapple with is that these right-wing mass explosions should not be legitimized in any way. You know, the tendency that I see of people saying, well, there really are legitimate grievances that are being handled in a certain way. No, what it is more that there are certain lenses through which very angry people are looking at the world and are looking at the crises that we're facing. And they're looking at them through lenses of race, ethnicity, gender, religion, and they're looking backwards. These right-wing authoritarian movements are in fact encouraging people to think that the future is somehow in the past. And so I think that we've got to understand this, and that these right-wing mass movements can be very comforting, because like most movements that are cultish and have conspiracy theories, they offer very easy answers to incredibly complex questions. And I don't know enough about what happened in July in South Africa, but just looking around the world, this is what we keep seeing. And we on the left have to understand that masses of people have become zombies. They have lost their humanity. They have lost their empathy. These are not good people. And this is really hard for us on the left, because we want to really believe that pretty much 99% of the world's population is good. And it's not that way.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, very, very good points. There's a number of other questions. James, I'm not sure if you saw one, but Zico had one to you about whether you guys drew lessons from places like the experiences of Syriza and places like Greece. And Vish, Zico also had questions to you about convergence, and also whether, I think Zico, if I can put words in your mouth, but whether taking on a frontal attack on the bourgeoisie. Zico's a comrade of ours that I've had many debates with over the years, so I'm putting words into his mouth. But I think that those were some questions to you, and also I think the issue of convergence. And yeah, see that Dale has a new question, which I haven't read yet, but if you guys want, Greg, this is open to you guys as well. If you have any comments, the South African violence and the US violence, since you had a different understanding of the coup. So you can raise that as well. And Bill, if I can just jump in as well. I had I agree. I think your analysis is fantastic. And what does it suggest if, given that the Republicans now, from what I understand, have basically said the January 6th event wasn't such a, I think they're not going after it. So what does that suggest for the future of democracy in the US, like in the very near future as well, not just long term? Okay, does anybody want to jump in? James, Bill, James, Vish, Colin, Greg?
I'm happy to jump in.
Call on you, or do you guys want to just jump in? Bill, I know you have to leave. Okay, James, okay. And Vish.
So I've just moved. There's some building work that was getting a little bit loud.
Oh, okay. But you're still.
But I'm still with you. But okay, on the Syriza question, I suppose we were both undone by the EU, but in very, very different ways. I think we did learn some things from the Syriza experience, and had the number of different people in the Corbyn team have close relationships with different people that are in Syriza or were in Syriza and broke with the party over the capitulation to the Troika. But also they're just because you understand what happened in a particular context doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to win. Greg had the nice quote, but between forced aside, the Marx quote, between two equal rights forced aside. Understanding the world can help you find the most effective path to strengthen your forces, so that you can then sorry to use such martial language, but then do battle on the social terrain against the ruling class. But just the fact that you understand what's going on doesn't mean that you're going to have built those forces. That said, I think there are still a lot of lessons from the Syriza experience that we could have taken on. We could have taken on more.
Michelle,
Thanks,
can I
James.
respond to your
Great.
question?
Yeah, sure. And then Vish will be, because Bill has to leave soon.
So two things. One is, in terms of what you're referring to, the Republican Party National Committee basically said that January 6th was legitimate political discourse, which is simply amazing when you look at what happened, the number of deaths, etc. So that's what I meant before, that the Republican Party has become the party for dictatorship. And but this is causing splinters within the Republican Party, because their leadership, some of their leadership recognizes that being the party for dictatorship may influence how people vote in the midterm elections in November. So we'll have to see. I think that the larger question is, democracy in the United States has always been fragile. Reminded me of the famous comment by Mahatma Gandhi when he was asked, what did he think of Western civilization? And he said he thought it would be a good idea. And I've often thought the same thing about democracy in the United States. We have a very uneven situation. It's always been very fragile. And I think that at this point, we're not just fighting to preserve democratic rights, we have to fight to extend democracy, to fight for consistent democracy. And that needs to be the battle cry of the left. And in order to do that, I go back to the point I was making about building a broad front. And this is really complicated, because in order to defeat the far right particularly, that means embracing people that are strategically our opponents, but tactically may be our allies. And this is very, very challenging, but that's what, I don't think that there's any alternative to that other than digging deep tunnels and praying.
Thanks. I don't like deep tunnels or praying as a solution. So I hope that there's more take up on what you're talking about. So Vish, can you, Vish, and I see you, James, I see you. Do you need it? Are you okay, James, if Vish goes first?
Yeah, that's fine. I just want to respond.
Okay, you wanted to register. Yeah. Great.
So I think,
and Bill, are you going to have to leave? So I just want to say, Bill, if you have to leave, I just want to thank you very much for participating.
Yeah, I wanted to hear what Vish had to say, and then I'm going to leave.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
thank you.
perfect. Okay, great. Thanks. Vish?
so yeah, I mean, I actually think that we must be very clear about the particular historical form of democracy that's in crisis. And I think over the past 4 decades, it's been a form of market or criminalized market democracy that's in crisis. And we're seeing that in South Africa, particularly. It's not a democracy that has enabled us to build adequate forms of people's power from below, amplify the boundaries and parameters of democracy, etc. It's been very circumscribed. It's been a limited form of democracy. I mean, you know, you have editorials in this country, like in the Business Day, that basically tell the population of this country that credit rating agencies are going to solve the economic policy issues. I mean, that's how brazen it is in terms of this market form of democracy. But it's reaching its limits, and it's being eaten up by contradictions. Now, in South Africa in July, a big part of, if you like, the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal was implicated in the violence that was unleashed. And in the streets and in the theater of all of that, and the tragedy of all of that, they were legitimizing that as a mode of politics. And that is very, very scary for South Africa. And I think that is the kind of parallel with the kind of minority project in the Republican Party as well, and the January 6th movement. I also think that this links to Zico's question. And, you know, the liberation project is self-destructing in South Africa. And it's got to do, you know, we can historicize it and we can see it in the various conjunctures we've been through and so on. But this is not enough for us as the left. There are different possibilities here. The one possibility is the Ramaphosa project is very constrained. You know, with all the revelations from the Zondo Commission about corruption and the cronyism in his own party, he's going to have to decide how far he's going to go in the battle with those inside his party. And I don't see him having the kind of stamina and the kind of stomach and the nerve to take the fight all the way through. So you might have some kind of compromise, and then South Africa's criminalized market democracy sort of hobbles along. The other possibility is that they plunge us into an all-out sort of civil war in this country. It becomes violence, okay? And I think the third possibility is they shift everything to the right, increasingly to the right. Now they've given license, they've given birth to some extreme right-wing nativist forces in South Africa as well. And these forces can actually, if you like, eclipse where the future goes. This is something that we really have to take on board and think about very, very carefully. On the flip side of all of this is how do we, if you like, ensure trans working class politics beyond narrow working class politics? How do we ensure trans feminist politics beyond single issue feminist politics? How do we go beyond trans environmental politics that is just single issue politics? I think this is the challenge for all the forces lining up in South Africa, at least. I think it was Bill that made this point. How do you find these convergences beyond our narrow comfort zones? And for me, the terrain of the deep, just transition, accelerating that in the midst of the climate crisis is where we can reimagine, where we can build, if you like, an alternative project for the country. But there are various challenges that lie on that path. Thanks.
Can I just come in
Thanks,
on?
Vish. Yeah, James, and then go ahead, James, and then I saw Colin. We'll come after James then.
Just on the Trump fascism, popular frontism stuff. I want to throw in a couple of words of caution. about pursuing that approach. The first is that the delegitimization of Trump and the Trumpists is precisely the tools that are used and will be used to delegitimize and deplatform progressive forces. Trump being taken off social media, social media is used against, let's take in Ecuador, for example, Rafael Correa was banned from Facebook, his supporters' accounts got taken down. But more fundamentally, at least in the UK example, where we saw, at least in 2018 and especially in 2019, appeals to popular frontism. I mean, I agree very much with Bill's idea that we can't just be in the size of a phone box, but and I support majoritarianism. But I think the problem with the popular frontism can be basic. If the Liberals are in charge and we're swinging underneath their banner, because I think they'll get us all killed. So we we saw this in the UK. Part of the reason why we shifted to a referendum to stop Brexit on any account was this logic that we had to have this broad alliance, and that the Liberals had the veto. So I'm just a little bit wary. I do understand the threat, but I'm a little bit wary of it, and more encouraged by the kinds of broad alliances that you construct that Vishwas alluded to on issues of climate and democratic climate and democracy as your means for building a majority, and which places the other side in the minority, rather than basically taking them on along the antagonism that they want.
Thanks, James. So I'm sure this would be a and have everybody kind of engaging on these issues. So I'm sure Bill would like to respond, but I'm going to give Colin a chance right now. Colin.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one comment and one question, actually back to James, though it bears on the question that was asked about Syriza. The question back to James is, would you say something more about your very first of the 5 strategic points that you made? You said it's a comms point, and I think it would be very helpful to have that developed in a few sentences more. You didn't have much time to do that, and I think it's a very interesting point, and it is, as I understand it, at the center of your new book, which you've been very modest about, but which I think will be much more wide interest than just for people in the UK. You didn't even tell us what it's called. I've read an early draft of it, and I think I'm very excited by it. So that's one question to James. The other point really is on Syriza. I mean, the point has been made that in both cases, there were very few on the left who were equipped to fulfill both the roles that had to be filled in the state and the roles that needed to be filled in the social movement arena. And that the tendency was for the state to gobble up the scarce people because of the need, and and for the party to lose its connections, which in the case of Syriza was even more important, with social movements. It seems to me that part of your message, James, is the distinctive kind of mobilization that's needed to create a broad movement. And I thought what you said at the beginning about hope and confidence needs to be stressed. I mean, for as long as one can remember now, the left of the Labour Party has been in opposition. There's an oppositional mentality. I mean, it even comes out, you know, in somebody like Simon Mohan's essay, where his last point is we must oppose neoliberalism. But it seems to me really important to capitalize on the huge, deep swell of disenchantment with what exists and the wish for something different. and to look forward. And that's what I think is exciting about James's thinking and reasoning in the light of the Corbyn experience and other experiences, which is really to start thinking about what it means to be in the state, what is required to be able to take the opportunity when it's secured. And that in itself is a way of thinking that the left is unused to, and which I think would find a lot of echo if in whatever arenas it's possible to put it forward. So I'm hoping that James will say a bit more about that.
Should I come in now?
Okay, great. Thanks, Colin. Before I, no, not yet. Sorry. Just in a moment, because I want to first raise a couple. There's been some comments in the thing that I want everybody to address as well. So one, Dale asking, well, this is related to Colin and Greg wants to say something too, but if you can address Dale's question of why there's nothing on China, it is an absence or a silence in the volume, given the prediction we know that are happening within China. So I think that's a really important question that Dale asked. But then right after Dale's question is a question by Gabriel, who says, is China not a model for South Africa? I mean, I have very strong views on that, but I'm not on the panel, so I'm going to not say anything, but I'm sure that a number of the panelists, certainly Vish and maybe Awanda and Samantha might have something to say too as discussants. And I'm sure actually everybody might have a comment on that. And then I think there's a really important question or point that I think should get reinforced, and that is by Janet and the rise of toxic patriarchal backlash that these authoritarianism. So, I mean, it's not a contradiction necessarily, but it is an extreme manifestation of what we're seeing in all the forms of authoritarianism, is the rise that it's coming together with a very extreme forms of patriarchal forms of oppression and misogynistic kind of approaches to women. So I'm just going to open it up, and I'm going to give you all, because we have 20 minutes left, and so I'm going to give you all a chance to respond. And I don't know if Awanda and Samantha want to say anything. If you do, please just raise your hand. But I can start with maybe Vish, I'll let you have the last word, if that's okay, Vish. Are you okay with that, Vish? Give your thumbs up. Okay. Then maybe Colin, Greg, James. So Bill's gone, and James, you should see the comment from Bill. We need to have another engagement for you guys. And then Awanda, and then Vish, you'll go. So I'm going in that.
No, I prefer to leave it to Greg, who I'm sure will talk a little bit about Warren Bellows' piece. But we do disclose that there is China is covered, but I'll leave it to Greg. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Colin. Greg?
Sure. So thanks for the wonderful presentations, and which reflect the kind of high quality of the interventions from Bill, James, and Vish. I should always say James and Hillary, since it's such a wonderful dialogue, having one of the prior generations leader of the British left dialoguing with a younger generation over the trajectory of British politics was really kind of a really great dialogue, and for the world, but always us in Canada, the British case and what's happening in British left politics, as well as the Americans, always kinds of spill over. I think both Samantha and Awanda raised a lot of good comments. I just want to pick up a couple of things from Samantha initially, that some of the difficulties of any single volume as we conceive these as a whole and between different things, and a lot of the recent writing that we did on social reproduction was in the prior two, particularly highlighting much of what Samantha was raising, and it is things that we need to come back to constantly. I think the comment that just came forward partly from Samantha, and I can't remember who raised it in the chat, but also on this turn in terms of male violence in the household during the pandemic, and as an aspect of the spread of right-wing politics is an important kind of specific feature that in fact we had commissioned an essay on this, Leo and I, and it fell through at the last minute, and so it didn't appear in the volume of one of the world's great sociologists, left sociologists, on this question, and kind of what seemed particular about this conjuncture. So we'll try to pick up that thread again. The point that Samantha raised also about extractivism, it's hard to live in North America without that being center, since in Canada and the US are one of the major zones of extractivism in the world. And in Canada, you live with this constantly, and it's part of today's struggles in a somewhat parallel way to it is in Africa, particularly South Africa, and it deals with a racial divide inside Canada with the colonization and the First Nations people. So it's part of everyday politics, which we've kind of largely been addressing in prior volumes in terms of the climate change issue. But in fact, we actually have commissioned several articles for the coming volume that we're working on capital and politics that deal with the extractivist sector, particularly one of the most odious aspects of the extractive sector for climate change, and that is, of course, the tar sands production, and which is the basis for Canada's position as a petropower in the world, and the project that's been going on in attempting to shut down the tar sands. So it is something that we've kind of been focusing on regularly and are trying to pick up. I think I want to say something, I guess, pick up just the thread of China before coming back to the debate with Bill, which I knew he was going to spark it, that debate. The background, and he didn't say, is, it's behind the scenes. It was a part of a debate that's been going on for a while between Bill Gindin, Sam Gindin, and Panich. It was going on for several years with this politics of how to think about this in the case, and quite distinct views about Popular Front politics. I'll just come back to in a second. But on China, Walden Walden was, I think, almost the perfect person to ask, and it was partly why Leo and I asked Walden for an essay to deal with the emergent and very important rivalry between the US and China. When you're in the Philippines, you've got a perfect perch and you're completely at the intersection between these two great powers, and have been for a century and a half or longer, depending on your time horizon. And the other thing is, of course, that what Walden has led for a very long time is obviously his own politics in and around the deglobalization project, but was also in the arch of the social movements in South Asia, and they're linked more widely through focus on the global South, and the attempt to kind of find a space for a multipolar world order. And so he was in the perfect perch to capture this, and that is what he raises, I think, in his essay by a little bit more probing some of the underlying political economic conditions in China that have kind of given rise to the contradictions of its militarism and the political economic strategies that are there, and what he sees as deepening competition over at the global summit. And he is not seeing this as a rivalry per se between the socialist economic systems and capitalist system as in the Cold War, but a configuration of two great powers searching to rebroker hegemony. And one can't forget that Xi Jinping during the great financial crisis said the US is not taking care enough of the global order, and Trump and we're willing to step in and make sure the global order is kept open for capitalism and Chinese business as well as others. And he's repeated it over the last couple of weeks again. And it is a very kind of national project that animates Chinese politics. And we've been fortunate to have the Lin Chun write several issues for us on Chinese global politics. Perhaps the most insightful writer on China today, with a fantastic new book out from Verso on revolution and counter-revolution in China, and just writing on marvelous essays about the kind of global context, and particularly unpacking and thinking through the change that occurred to the period that she's critical of but sympathetic to at the same time, the Bandung period in China's foreign policy, which she argues of how distance is the Belt and Road Initiative and everything else from that politics today, which is exactly the same theme that Walden picks up partly in his essay. Dale's question on the polarization in China, it's on the actually it's on the agenda for the next volume. We have a couple of issues, a couple of essays coming on exactly that question about capitalist organization in China and working class strategies in that context, and particularly unpacking, some of them will unpack a bit the kind of global mythologies that have been spread about the complete elimination of poverty in China, where there's there's 600 million people still living well below a very low and arbitrary poverty line, and so the polarizations around income are still very deep there. Let me come back to the bills and the wider discussion about the Popular Front. I think the difficulty of thinking this
Just
totally.
briefly, we have 10 minutes left. That's it.
Yeah, I'll just be
That's
1
fine.
minute. I'll just be 1 minute on this.
Okay, that's
Is the context is so different from the historical way those strategies came up. There's no left that's organizing, and no working class and socialist movement that's organizing in a way that provides a base easily for convergence or has an emergent socialist politics. And the difficulty of moving into these wider fronts in the US case is there's no socialist pool that enters into that. And is the problem at this moment, the crisis of centrism only and the polarization only of the hard right forming, which obviously we all would recognize as a danger and building specific types of political coalitions, but there's nothing there in terms of an organized working class in the sense of a political party or even a resurgent union movement present. And that question of building has to be on a point of any convergence, has to be about that aspect of working class organization.
Thanks, Greg. Great. So Awanda says that he was going to speak on China, but you covered it well, so he didn't add anything. So James, did you want to say something? You were going to respond. There was quite a few points to you, and
yeah. Thanks, Colin. I will. I'll send you the check later for the publicity. Thank you. My book's called Our Block, How We Win. To the point about confidence and hope, and then I think how that leads into organizing and particularly how we orientate ourselves. There's an enormous gap between what the hegemonic ideology says it provides for people and what it actually provides for people, and that's the gap between those two things, between its claims at equality, freedom, liberty, and so forth, and the reality for people, of course, in different ways for different types of people, is of course vast. And I think the challenge for those on the left is not only to expose that gap between the two, but give people or help build the levels of organization on individual struggles, and then knit together those organizations into a potential counter-hegemonic bloc, that they can make any change in those things. And I think that, and I speak particularly in the UK context, got extremely good, and I think it's the same for the US left as well, as the left got chased away from mainstream society and trade unions got smashed backwards and so on, and the left basically got holed up in the academy, and only in certain bits of the academy anyway. We got terribly good at saying how things are terrible, and we felt terribly smart because we told because we had the most nuanced analysis of how crap everything is and how the system is really exploitative, and really it says it does nice things, but really it does terrible things. And I think, again, at least in the global north context, after the financial crisis, like everybody already believes this. The basic common sense for most people in British society is that the system sucks, it benefits the rich, it doesn't benefit most people. But then the question is, but what can you do about it? And I think the task of building hope and confidence, that is a material question. It's not just tell people that things can be better. It is the building of organization. It is the mobilizing of people so that they can see their strength and see that there is an alternative that they can bring forward, that they can be active in. So it's in that sense that that hope and confidence are our watchwords, rather than just sort of saying, oh no, everything's about to get loads better, because false hope in not backed up by anything material is immensely demobilizing, and that's what we have to guard against.
Great, thanks, James. Vish?
All right, thanks. Just one or two quick points. I think this point about China and just kind of importing even sort of cultural practices and so on from China, I think we've got to really be careful on the left. And I think the experience of the century and learning lessons around internationalism, I think has given us all a sense that it's not just latching on to what's out there. We've got to be careful. We've got to analyze these struggles, these countries, these contexts, etc. We've had the Third International instrumentalizing left forces and controlling them and so on. China has its own interests as well, so we've got to be very, very careful. It doesn't mean, of course, there isn't room for internationalism and positive solidarities in the world. And again, we've got to locate that very, very carefully in our politics. So I just want to make that point. The second quick point I want to make is that, yes, I think Janet is right. I mean, there is a second coming of fascism, and we shouldn't just straitjacket it as fascism like in the 20th century. And yes, it is protecting institutions of capitalism, property, but at the same time, it's also expressing itself in the context of the fourth great crisis of capitalism, probably its last great crisis in my view, but it's expressing itself in that context. And it has various ideological elements articulated in it, religious fundamentalism, a social conservatism, and yes, a patriarchal imaginary, and so on, a racism deeply. And so we really have to take stock of this. And again, as I said earlier, we got to find different fronts of attacking this. It's bringing to the fore, if you like, all the oppressions that progressive humanity has been fighting against. And so, how do we counter this? I think is a very, very important question. My final point is just that I think the idea of democratic systemic reforms is very, very important for our strategic conversation. It links maybe with what our colleague was telling us from James was telling us. I think democratic systemic reforms is something that rises to the moment in terms of systems change, bringing people in to the transformation and so on. And it's a concept we've been working with, but I think there's some nice overlap with James. Thanks.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, everyone. I think this was a very, very robust and wonderful conversation. I think we probably could have gone on if it wasn't such a weird time for everybody. But thanks to the wonderful thanks to Samantha and Awanda for being discussants. And a special thanks for this wonderful volume to all the authors, and also to Greg, Colin, and Leo for continuing to publish the Socialist. I mean, it's been a beacon of a source, a resource for the left. I mean, I remember when I was a grad at Berkeley in the early 90s, I mean, I think it's been enormously important, I think, around the world for progressives who are trying to kind of find their way. So thanks for keeping this. We know how difficult it is to keep these things on running and how much work it is. And the footprint on it is also very clear. It's a wonderful contribution to the world. So thank you. Democratic Marxism series that came out in 2021, a few months ago, was on destroying democracy. And it really raises many of these issues as well. So we're converging in many spaces as well. I also would just, there's something about that Bill said, and I think it kind of converges in a different way with James, this looking to the past, how I often feel the global north is not the left, obviously, sometimes looking to the past and to reclaim a past. And one of the things I've always found extraordinarily positive and hopeful in South Africa is that it's not a past that we glorify or want to go back to, and it's a future that we're looking, and you feel that it's because that informs all the discussions and debates that we have here, which I think is a very different kind of context that we experience here than in many places in the world. And I think it's a huge positive thing that we have to work with. And then I just want to thank the Democratic Marxism series, the Emancipatory Futures Project, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, the Second Office, who has journeyed with us for many, many years and just an amazing partner. And most of all to COPAC and the team behind COPAC, which is Jane, Awanda, Charles, and Ferial. So thank you very much to everybody. And then of course to all of you. So have a lovely evening, late morning, mid-afternoon, wherever you are. I don't know what time it is where you are, James, but thanks. And I hope everyone has a good evening or day.
Time for breakfast.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Enjoy breakfast, Greg.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Hi,
Thank you,
glass of
Michelle,
wine,
everybody.
please.
Thank you.
Thanks, Awanda,
Thank you,
Samantha.
everyone.
Take
Yeah,
care.
Yeah,
Ciao,
thanks,
ciao.
everyone.
Bye, everyone.